The crystal chandeliers of Seattle's waterfront Grand Hotel cast a warm, glittering glow over the packed reunion ballroom, where soft jazz hummed through the speakers, and the low buzz of hundreds of alumni voices filled every corner. It was their 15-year college reunion, a night most people came to celebrate old memories, catch up with long-lost friends, and show off the lives they'd built after graduation. For Evelyn Carter, though, the entire event felt like a minefield she'd been forced to walk through alone. She'd debated skipping it for months, telling herself there was no good reason to revisit the past. No reason to step back into a room full of people who'd once watched her shrink into the shadow of her charismatic, ambitious then-husband, Marcus Holloway. But Lena had begged her to come, insisting it would be good for her to stand in the room as the woman she was now, not the quiet, overlooked girl everyone remembered. So Evelyn had come, dressed simply in a tailored charcoal dress and subtle heels, her dark hair pulled back in a neat, professional bun, determined to keep a low profile, say quick hellos, and slip out before the night turned messy. For the first hour, her plan worked perfectly. She drifted through small clusters of former classmates, exchanging light, polite small talk about jobs, homes, and kids, laughing softly at old college inside jokes, and keeping her distance from the center of the room where the loudest, most attention-hungry alumni lingered. No one pressed her about her life. No one asked invasive questions. And for a little while, she almost relaxed. She'd spent the last 5 years rebuilding every part of herself after her brutal divorce from Marcus. After he'd left her with a one-sided settlement, tarnished her reputation in their mutual friend group, and walked away to build a glamorous, wealthy life, Evelyn had started over from zero. She'd gone back to school for her MBA, worked late nights in quiet office cubicles, climbed the corporate ladder one grueling step at a time, and finally landed her role as Senior Director of Operations at a fast-growing Seattle tech. It was a life she'd built entirely on her own. No help, no handouts, no credit from anyone, and especially not from Mark. Most people from their old college days had no idea any of it had happened. All they remembered was the quiet wife who'd stood behind his spotlight, and Evelyn had been fine letting them hold that outdated impression. She didn't need their validation. The peace shattered the second Marcus Holloway walked through the ballroom. The room's energy shifted instantly, a hush falling over nearby conversations as heads turned. At 39, Marcus was still every inch the charming, confident golden boy they'd known in college, tall and sharply dressed in a custom navy suit, his smile easy and practiced, designed to draw eyes and command attention. Tucked perfectly on his arm was Chloe Marlowe, a sleek, striking marketing specialist a few years younger than them, her blonde hair styled immaculately, her red lipstick bold and... She smiled warmly at the crowd, completely oblivious to the quiet storm Marcus was about to unleash, unaware she was about to be a prop in his long-awaited revenge against his... Evelyn's shoulders tensed the second their gazes locked across the room. She'd known he would come, if he would. Marcus never missed a chance to show off his ass, but she'd foolishly hoped he'd ignore her, that he'd be too busy soaking up the crowd's admiration to... She turned to walk away, ready to duck into a small group of old acquaintances and disappear. But Marcus was already moving toward her, his steps deliberate and unhurried, cutting through the crowd like he owned every inch of the ballroom floor. The conversations around them died completely, as people sensed the incoming tension, every eye drifting to the former couple, curious and expectant. Lena, who'd been standing beside Evelyn sipping a glass of wine, stiffened and leaned in, her voice sharp and warning. "Don't let him get in your head." Evelyn nodded silently, her jaw tight, but she could feel the old, familiar flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck, the same shame she'd spent years burying, threatening. Marcus stopped directly in front of her, Chloe still on his arm, her polite smile faltering as she noticed the cold hostility. He looked Evelyn up slowly, his gaze dismissive and mocking, like he was inspecting a leftover piece of a life he guarded. "Evelyn," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone within 10 feet to hear, warm and fake and drip tension. "It's so good to see you. Honestly, I wasn't sure you'd show. I figured you'd be too busy with whatever it is days." A quiet, awkward chuckle rippled through the nearby crowd. He knew full well no one knew her career, and he was intentional at keeping it that way, about framing her life as small and insignificant. Before Evelyn could respond, before Lena could jump in to defend her, Marcus doubled down, his tone growing sharper, more theatrical for the watching crowd. "You know, I've always felt a little guilty about how things ended for you," he said, tilting his head in sincerity. Building a career is hard when you never really focus back in school. You spent those years supporting me, putting my dreams first, and then everything fell apart. I've always wanted. He paused, glancing around at the sea of watching faces, letting the suspense build, before delivering the cruel blow he'd clearly planned all along. My company's hiring for a front desk receptionist right now. It's steady work, full-time benefits, flexible hours, no fancy degree required, just basic organization. I think it'd be perfect for you. I'd be happy to get you an interview. Consider it for old times' sake. The ballroom went dead silent for a beat, then erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Dozens of pairs of eyes locked on Evelyn, waiting to see her crumble, waiting to watch the quiet ex-wife shrink in humiliation. It was a calculated, brutal public takedown, framing her as unemployed, unaccomplished, dependent on his charity, someone who could only qualify for an entry-level after their divorce. Chloe's eyes widened in shock, her smile dropping completely as she turned to Marcus, clearly stunned by his unnecessary cruelty. She'd never seen this side of him, the petty, cruel side that thrived on making someone else look small, look bigger. Evelyn's hands tightened slightly around the stem of her wine glass, her knuckles whitening, but her face stayed calm, composed. No trace of the hurt and rage swirling beneath her steady exterior. She'd practiced this moment 100 times in her head over the years, imagined running into him, imagined his arrogance, and she'd sworn she'd never give him action of seeing her break. She lifted her chin, her gaze steady and unflinching as she met his smug, triumphant eyes. I appreciate the offer, Marcus, she said evenly, her voice clear and calm. No tremor, no anger, just quiet, unshakable poise. But I'm not looking for work right now. I'm very happy with my career. Marcus laughed out loud, a short, mocking sound that cut through the quiet crowd. Right, your career. He rolled his eyes, glancing at the people as if sharing a private joke. Forgive me if I'm skeptical. Last I checked, you never built anything for yourself. Evelyn, good for you. He turned back to Chloe, slipping his arm tighter around her waist, ready to move on and soak up the praise of the crowd, convinced he'd just won the entire night, convinced his ex-wife firmly back in her place. What Marcus didn't see, what no one in the room yet saw, the way Evelyn's jaw set harder, the quiet resolve settling deep in her chest. This night was supposed to be a harmless trip down memory lane, a chance for her to close the door on her past once and for all. But Marcus's public humiliation had burned that door wide open, erasing every bit of peace she'd fought to build. Her low-profile plan was dead. Her desire to avoid conflict was gone. He'd forced her into the spotlight, forced to confront the old wounds she'd buried. Now there was no going back. As the crowd continued to whisper and stare, as Marcus preened beside his girlfriend, completely confident in his victory, a tall, sharp-dressed man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped quietly through the ballroom entrance. He scanned the room briefly, his gaze landing instantly on Evelyn. A friendly smile tugged at his lip. It was Julian Hale, Chief Operating Officer of her company, the highest-ranking executive she'd spent 5 years helping build. He'd mentioned weeks ago the plan to attend their university reunion, but Evelyn had never imagined he'd walk in right as her husband finished publicly demeaning her. He began walking straight toward her, his purpose clear, and in that moment, the entire false narrative Marcus had built tonight was already starting to unravel. The humiliating night Marcus had planned as his greatest victory was about to become the beginning of his worst nightmare. Julian Hale's quiet approach drew no attention in the bustling ballroom. To every alumnus present, he was just another accomplished guest catching up with old peers. Only Evelyn recognized the quiet significance of his visit. Still basking in his petty public victory, Marcus remained completely oblivious, working the crowd to soak in familiar admiration. He pulled Chloe closer, laughing with his former fraternity brothers and rewriting the night's moment in his head, framing himself as a generous, forgiving ex who'd pitied a stagnant, unremarkable Evelyn. Julian stopped at a polite distance, his tone warm and casual, stripped of their usual office hierarchy. Evelyn, I wasn't sure I'd spot you tonight, he said softly. Glad you could make it. It's strange seeing everyone outside of work deadlines and conference rooms. Evelyn's shoulders relaxed, and she offered her first genuine smile since Marcus cornered her. I almost skipped out, she admitted. I'm glad I came. This simple, equal exchange grounded her, quietly erasing the shame Marcus's cruel jab had inflicted and reaffirming her hard-earned professional identity. The fragile reprieve faded fast. Marcus caught their interaction out of the corner of his eye, his grin dropping into sharp, suspicious confusion. He knew Julian's reputation as a top Seattle operations executive, a leader in the regional tech industry. What he could not fathom was why such a high-caliber professional would treat his ordinary ex-wife as a peer. Trapped in his outdated worldview, Marcus still saw Evelyn as the quiet, background spouse who'd once managed his daily life and sacrificed her own goals for his early career. Insecurity curdled into sharp irritation. Marcus excused himself from his friends, tugging Chloe along with him, his easy charm vanishing into quiet territorial tension. Chloe had already been unsettled by his public cruelty earlier, stunned by how eagerly he'd humiliated the woman he'd once married. In 6 months of dating, he'd only shown her his polished, confident, successful side. Tonight, she saw the petty, bitter insecurity he'd hidden beneath his perfect public facade, leaving her deeply uneasy. "You two know each other?" Marcus asked, his tone casually challenging. Julian extended a hand, calm and unshaken by the sudden "Julian, I work with..." The plain, unassuming statement knotted Marcus's chest. His handshake turned stiff, his smile brittle and forced. "Marcus Holloway, old class..." He scanned Evelyn's face for any sign of a fleeting, superficial connection, unwilling to accept they shared genuine professional comment. Desperate to regain his footing, Marcus steered the talk toward his familiar success. "Your firm's had incredible growth these past few years." "Very impressive." Julian nodded politely, unfazed by his transparent posturing. "Our team drives that progress. Evelyn's been pivotal in scaling our regional operations." The quiet statement sliced cleanly through Marcus's inflated self-image, shattering every assumption he'd clung to for had. Marcus froze, his smug expression bubbling. Years of dedicated high-level work, not a temporary gig, not a desperate side job, but a legitimate, thriving career he'd never once suspected existed. His grand, carefully planned humiliation stunt had backfired spectacularly. He'd mocked and pitied a woman who'd built a far more grounded, respected life than he'd ever acknowledged, all while he'd assumed she'd fallen apart without him. Too arrogant to concede defeat, Marcus doubled down on his skepticism openly. "That's news to me. I never knew you got into corporate operations. You never talked career goals back together." Evelyn's patience frayed completely. She loathed having to defend her achievements to the man who'd once dismissed her ambitions as useless, who'd pressured her to set aside every dream to fuel his career. "We never had equal conversations back then." "Marcus," she replied firmly, steady and unyielding. "You were too busy building your future." Julian stepped subtly backward, giving them space while remaining a quiet, impartial witness to the change. The words hung thick in the air, unmissable to anyone nearby, a quiet rebuke of his long arrogance. Chloe shifted awkwardly, her faith in Marcus wavered time. He'd always told her he was the wronged party in their divorce, painting Evelyn as unmotivated attached. But watching him nitpick and minimize his ex-wife's clear success, she could feel the cracks in his carefully crafted lies. The charming, grounded partner she'd fallen for felt unrecognizable in this bitter, insecure man lashing at ego. Slipping fast out of control of the moment, Marcus forced a sharp laugh. "Well, good for you. Glad you fix." His dismissive tone made it clear he still refused to accept the truth of her success. He grabbed Chloe's wrist and tugged her toward the bar, eager to escape the awkward created. "We're grabbing a drink. Catch you later." Once out of earshot, Chloe pulled her arm free, her voice sharp with unfiltered disapproval. "That was cruel and unnecessary. You humiliated her in front of everyone tonight, then act shocked she has a career. Why does her success bother you so much?" Marcus's charm vanished entirely, his resentment. "You don't understand. She left me with nothing. I built every part of my life from the ground up. I worked like she outdid me." Lena slipped beside Evelyn, barely containing her quiet triumph. He had absolutely no clue. Zero. For years. He's bragged about outgrowing a failed marriage and a stagnant ex, and he never knew your appear to want executives. Evelyn exhaled, still guarded. "It's not a real win. Embarrassed people never back down. Save face." Word of Marcus's patronizing receptionist job offer rapidly through the crowd. Alumni clustered together to whisper, their opinions swiftly shifting. The initial judgment cast Evelyn faded into sympathy, as everyone began to recognize Marcus's charitable gesture was nothing more than calculated. Public humiliation. Burned by embarrassment and wounded pride. Marcus leaned and pulled out his phone. He scrolled furiously through professional profiles, company updates, and industry articles, desperate to dig up of Evelyn's career. He needed leverage. Any small flaw or lesser detail he could use to restore his shattered sense of classmates. Chloe watched his frantic search out and disappointment. She'd fallen for Marcus's poise and stability, imagining a secure future together. But tonight, she'd uncovered his core bitterness, his need to compete with and degrade his ex-wife to validate his own worth. The future she'd envisioned such fragile and untrustworthy. Soft music and distant laughter filled the ballroom, and Evelyn briefly heard of the night's drama was over. Lena's urgent voice crushed that fragile hope instantly. I just heard a few old classmates talking. Marcus is planning a formal toast later. He's calling it closing old chapters and honoring past bonds. She paused, tone sharp with warning. We both know public attack. The night's tentative, easy balance shattered completely. The public humiliation earlier had only been Marcus's opening move. He refused to leave the night defeated, and he was already plotting a far more devastating pick to reclaim his reputation. Evelyn's hardest battle at the reunion was only just beginning. The warm glow of the chandeliers no longer felt celebratory. For Evelyn, every flicker of light across the crowded ballroom felt like a spotlight, waiting to lock onto her the second Marcus made his next move. Lena's warning hung heavy in the air between them, sharp and unshakable. A formal toast meant no private escape, no quiet exit, no fading into the crowd. When Marcus spoke in front of the entire reunion, every eye in the room would be fixed on her, ready to watch her either crumble or stand her ground. After years of avoiding conflict, of choosing peace over confrontation, Evelyn knew she could no longer hide. She'd spent the first 2 hours of the night defensive, reactive, desperate to stay unseen. That strategy had failed completely. Marcus had turned her quiet nature into a weakness, weaponized her refusal to argue to paint her as small, unaccomplished, and insignificant. If she continued to shrink back, he would succeed in rewriting their history entirely, convincing every old classmate that he was the sole winner of their split, that she'd wasted her life without him. Evelyn's fingers brushed the edge of her phone in her clutch, the faint weight of her hidden evidence, a quiet reminder that she'd never been the failure he'd made her out to be. You don't have to stay and take this, Lena said quietly, scanning the room for Marcus's position. We could slip out early. No one would blame you for avoiding his petty stunt. Evelyn shook her head, her resolve hardening into something steady and unyielding. Running meant letting him win. It meant letting his cruel narrative stand unchallenged, letting every whispered judgment go unanswered, letting him spend years bragging about how he'd chased his ex-wife away in shame. She'd rebuilt her dignity too carefully to surrender it over one man's ego. I'm not leaving, Evelyn said firmly. If he's going to make a public speech about me, I'm going to be here to watch every word. I'm done hiding from what people think. Across the ballroom, Marcus had finished his frantic deep dive into her professional background. His phone screen had filled with corporate bios, press releases, and team leadership spotlights that confirmed every word Julian had spoken. Evelyn was not just employed. She was integral to one of the most successful tech operations in the Pacific Northwest. Respected by executives, trusted by leadership, and steadily rising in an industry Marcus struggled to compete. The discovery did not humble. It enraged him. To Marcus, her success was not hard work or resilience. It was a personal insult, a deliberate attempt to outshine him after he'd discarded. He slipped his phone into his suit pocket, his jaw tight, his smile gone entirely. Chloe watched him, her skepticism blooming into clear disappointment. She could see the resentment simmering in his posture, the way his eyes locked on Evelyn across the room with unmasked hostility, and she finally understood this was not harmless. This was absurd. Marcus pushed away from the bar and crossed the room without a second thought, cutting through clusters of chatting alumni with single-minded. He was done with subtle jabs and casual trickery. He intended to re-establish his dominance before the night ended, to correct the injustice of Evelyn outgrowing the box he'd. When he stopped in front of her, Lena stepped forward instinctively, ready to intercept any new assault. But Evelyn lifted a hand, quieting. She was ready to face alone. You busy, Marcus said, his voice low and sharp, no longer performing for the crowd, no longer hiding his bitterness behind charm. Senior Director of Operations. Impressive title. You hit. Evelyn met his gaze evenly, refusing to flinch from his sharp tone. I didn't hide it, Marcus. You never asked. You never... The simple truth stopped him short, his prepared retort faltering for... Don't act like this is some big victory for you, he snapped, recovering quickly. A corporate title doesn't erase the fact that you left me when I was building. You bailed on our future, and now you want to walk in here and act like you've out-earned me? Evelyn finally understood the anger. It was never about her career. It was about control. For years, he'd defined his worth by being the successful one, the provider, the winner of their broken marriage, and her growth had stripped him of that entirely. I didn't bail on your future, she replied calmly, each word deliberate and clear. I bailed on being invisible while you built it. I spent years putting your goals first, and you never once considered mine. Now I have a life that's entirely mine. Stand it. Marcus scoffed, dismissive and defensive, unwilling to absorb her point. Sure. That's the story you tell. Their quiet, heated exchange caught the attention of nearby guests, who slowly drifted their way. Curious eyes lingered on the pair. Julian Hale, still lingering near the edge of the crowd, noticed the growing confrontation and moved closer, his presence subtle, unmistakable. He did not interrupt, but his proximity sent a clear message. Evelyn was not alone, not professionally, in this room. Marcus saw Julian approach and burned with elation. He hated that Evelyn now had powerful people in her corner, hated that he no longer held every ounce of social and professional power between them. This isn't over, he muttered, leaning as she could hear. Enjoy your corporate win tonight. The toast is still happening, and you won't like what I have to say about it. For the first time all night, Evelyn did not back down from his threat. She held his gaze steady, unafraid of public attack. Say whatever you want, Marcus. I'm not the same person you remember. You're anymore. The statement landed firmly, a quiet declaration of her newfound strength, and Marcus blinked, caught off guard by her unshakable poise. He'd expected tears, defensiveness, embarrassment, never calm, wavering confidence. He turned his heel and stormed away, grabbing Chloe's hand and pulling her toward the stage area where the MC was for speeches. Chloe followed reluctantly, her eyes lingering on Evelyn, conflict swirling in her chest. She was no longer sure she was the man she'd fallen for. The generous, driven entrepreneur she'd admired was gone, replaced by a petty, vengeful man with his old grudge. Lena exhaled beside Evelyn, quiet courage. That was the first time you've ever stood up to him like that, she said softly. You never used to see how strong you are. Evelyn nodded, her chest tight with nerves and resolve. I'm telling him to find who I am. If he wants to air our past in front of everyone, fine. Let him. I'm fine with people to know the truth. The room's atmosphere shifted entirely as the MC stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. Soft background music faded to silence and every ballroom turned forward. Glasses clinked quietly, conversations died out, and a hush fell over the crowd. The alumni segment was about to begin, and Marcus Holloway was already positioning himself at the front of the line, his posture rigid, expression determined. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened, but she did not look away. She planted her feet firmly on the ballroom floor, lifted her chin, prepared herself for the storm. She had shifted from passive victim to active defender, choosing past instead of fleeing it. But as the MC called for the first speaker and Marcus's hand closed tightly around the stage microphone, she realized her small victim with a devastating new cost. The public war she'd spent half a decade avoiding was finally irreversibly underway. The ballroom's soft music faded completely the second the MC gripped the stage microphone, and a thick, anticipatory hush settled over the crowd. Every alumni conversation died mid-sentence. Every glass paused mid-toast. All eyes locking on the stage where Marcus stood waiting. He'd shed every trace of his easy, charming persona, his posture sharp and rigid, his stare fixed straight on Evelyn across the room. For her part, Evelyn stood steady beside Lena, her earlier resolve firm, convinced she could weather whatever petty, one-sided narrative Marcus planned to broadcast. She assumed his toast would be nothing more than bitter ex-husband gossip, shallow jabs meant to rattle her and win over the crowd. It was her first critical miscalculation of the night. Marcus did not start with mockery or cheap insults. He opened warm, nostalgic, and disarmingly sincere, reminiscing about their college romance, their early married years, the quiet dreams they'd shared right after graduation. He spoke of late nights building business plans, of youthful hope, of two kids with nothing but ambition and each other. The crowd softened immediately, leaning in with sympathetic smiles, buying every word of his curated nostalgia. For a long, tense moment, Evelyn almost relaxed, until his tone shifted, slow and deliberate, twisting the past into a weapon. "We had everything back then," Marcus said, his voice steady and earnest for the crowd. "But ambition only works when both people show up. I spent every year grinding to build a stable future for us," while Evelyn slowly checked out. She grew tired of the hustle, tired of the uncertainty, tired of building something together. In the end, she chose comfort over commitment. She left me mid-build, walked away from our life before it could flourish, and left me to pick up every broken piece alone. The room rippled with quiet sympathy, and Evelyn's blood ran cold. He'd crafted the perfect, polished lie, one that painted him as the loyal, hard-working victim, and her as the flaky, ungrateful quip. It was not a cruel joke or a petty jab. It was a deliberate public revision of their entire history, designed to erase every sacrifice she'd made, every dream she'd set aside for his career. Before she could process the damage, he doubled down, planting a subtle, poisonous rumor that spread like wildfire through the crowd. "I'm truly happy to see her thriving now," he continued, feigning generosity. "Everyone deserves stability, especially after walking away from the hard days. I hope she understands none of this would have been possible without the foundation we built together. Some people only learn to value success after they abandon the person building it for them." The line landed perfectly, cloaked in goodwill, but dripping with malice. To every listening alumnus, it sounded like Evelyn had reaped the rewards of Marcus's labor after abandoning him, that her entire career was a byproduct of his hard. Lena tensed beside her, jaw tight with. "He can't get away with this," she hissed, ready to step forward and correct the lie on the spot. Evelyn stopped her with a sharp, quiet gesture, her mind. In that moment, she made her second devastating miscalculation. She believed calm politeness would diffuse the chaos. She thought if she stayed composed, refused to fight back, the crowd would see through his. She feared reacting would make her look bitter, irrational, or guilty, exactly how Marcus was framing her. So she stayed quiet, standing still while the room's opinion shifted irreversibly. Chloe watched from the edge of the stage, her chest tight with horror. She'd never heard this version of their split. Marcus had always told her the divorce was mutual, that they'd simply grown apart, that there was no bad blood blame. Now she watched him systematically destroy his ex-wife's reputation to inflate her. The man she'd dated, the stable, mature entrepreneur trusted, was a stranger to her. Every sweet story he'd told her about his past felt like a Once his toast ended and the polite applause faded, Marcus stepped off the stage to warm sympathy. Classmates slapped his back, told him he'd handled the past with grace, praised his kindness for wishing Evelyn well after. He soaked it all in, his confidence fully restored, every earlier crack in his ego sealed over by the crowd's unearned validation. He shot Evelyn a cold, triumphant glance as he passed, silently celebrating. Within minutes, small groups clustered across the ballroom, whispering the new narrative Mark hated. Alumni who'd smiled at Evelyn earlier now avoided her gaze, their expressions awkward. Some shot Marcus pitying looks. Others murmured that she'd always seemed a little detached back in college, ungrateful for the win. The quiet respect she'd earned after Julian's earlier interaction vanished entirely, replaced by uncontrolled judgment. Desperate to salvage the moment, Evelyn tried gentle damage control, chatting softly with old friends, explaining she'd worked hard for her career, that the split was far more complicated than described. But her calm, measured defenses felt weak against the sweeping story he'd planted. People had already made up their minds. Nuance couldn't compete with the simple, tragic tale. The first real crack in her support system appeared when even Lena grew frustrated. "I want you fight back," Lena was low and urgent. "He just lied to every single person here and ruined your reputation in 5 minutes. You have proof of what he did. Say something." Evelyn shook her head, trapped in cautious logic. She feared a public outburst would make her look unstable, would hand Marcus more ammunition to be vengeful. She misjudged the moment entirely, choosing restraint when the crowd craved clarity, choosing calm when only live. While Evelyn hesitated, Marcus capitalized silence. He pulled Chloe through the crowd, accepting congratulations, leaning into his victim narrative, and every quiet whisper in the room his position. Chloe's trust frayed further with every passing minute, her loyalty wavering as she watched him thrive off tearing down once loved. By the time the night's formal program ended, the room's entire energy had flipped. Marcus was the sympathetic hero, and Evelyn was the selfish ex who'd abandoned her husband and now clung to the success he'd built for her. Her years of quiet resilience, her grueling career growth, her stolen business idea, none of it mattered anymore. Buried under his polished lies. Alone by the far ballroom window, Evelyn finally let her facade slip, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. She'd tried to rise above the conflict, choose dignity over drama. She'd lost badly. Her cautious misjudgment had cost her respect entirely. But before she could regroup, her phone vibrated once in her clutch. She pulled it out to find a tagged post in the alumni Facebook group. A guest had filmed Marcus's entire toast, clipped it short and capped it. Class act. Moving old heartbreak with grace. The video was already gaining likes and comments, spreading beyond the ballroom to every alumnus watching from home. In that instant, Evelyn realized the damage was no longer to tonight's reunion. Marcus's lies were permanent, public, and spreading fast, and her chance to correct the narrative before it spiraled out of control was already gone. The Facebook video spread faster than the reunion gossip. Within minutes, dozens of alumni who'd left the early festivities were commenting, sharing their sympathy for Marcus and echoing the untrue narrative he'd crafted. Evelyn stared at her phone screen, her throat tight with disbelief as strangers and old acquaintances alike painted her as the selfish, reckless ex who'd abandoned a good man. All her years of quiet sacrifice, every late night rebuilding her life alone, were erased in a 60-second clip that only showed Marcus's graceful, victimized version of the truth. Lena stepped beside her, glancing at the screen, her expression hardening with urgent frustration. This isn't just a room full of people anymore. This is permanent. He's ruined your reputation in our entire alumni network overnight. Evelyn slipped her phone back into her clutch, forcing her panic down. She'd spent the night choosing restraint, convinced dignity would outlast deception, but her inaction had only let Marcus's lies take root and spread unchecked. There was no more room for passive resilience. If she wanted to salvage her truth, she would have to fight for it openly. No more hiding, no more polite silence. Across the ballroom, Marcus was riding the wave of public sympathy, shaking hands and accepting praise from nearly every guest who crossed his path. Chloe lingered half a step behind him, her smile hollow, her eyes scanning the room for Evelyn with unspoken guilt and doubt. Marcus's confidence was unshakable now. The earlier flicker of insecurity he'd felt upon learning of Evelyn's career was gone, replaced by unbridled arrogance. He'd successfully turned the entire room against her, weaponized public empathy to cover his own past failures, and he believed he'd fully won the night. He'd skimmed her professional profile earlier, noted her impressive title, but dismissed it as hollow corporate success, something flashy on paper that could never compare to his self-made entrepreneurial legacy. The tide began to shift in an instant, triggered by a single offhand conversation. Julian Hale had joined a small group of industry professionals in attendance, chatting casually about upcoming company milestones and regional project expansions. The conversation drifted to team leadership, and one local business owner raised his glass toward Julian, voice loud enough for nearby guests to overhear. Your firm's operational turnaround this year is unmatched. Word is, your senior lead single-handedly restructured the regional workflow and boosted annual revenue by nearly 30%. That's next-level leadership. Julian nodded, his gaze drifting easily across the room to land on Evelyn, his tone calm and unreservedly sincere. That's all Evelyn Carter. She's the backbone of our regional growth. We wouldn't be celebrating half our wins without her strategic oversight and years of ground. The statement hung in the air, sharp and unignorable, cutting straight through the fog of Marcus's manufactured lies. Every nearby conversation stuttered to it. Dozens of heads turned, eyes wide with fresh realization, as alumni connected the respected executive leader Julian praised to the woman Marcus had just framed as a lazy, ungrateful quitter who abandoned responsibility. Marcus heard every word. His smile dropped instantly, the color draining from his face as the full weight of his miscalculation crashed over him. He'd thought Evelyn's career was a minor, late-in-life win, a basic corporate job she'd stumbled into after their... He'd never imagined she was the driving force behind one of Seattle's most celebrated business rounds, a respected industry leader whose work was admired by top executives across. For the first time all night, he understood the depth of his ache. He hadn't humiliated. He'd publicly embarrassed. Desperate to confirm the truth, Marcus pulled out his phone again, scrolling frantically through detailed company reports and industry feature articles he'd overlooked earlier. He scanned interview after interview, leadership spotlights and project breakdowns, every piece of evidence proving Evelyn had built an extraordinary, reputable career entirely on. No handouts, no leftover foundation from the old marriage, no shortcuts, just consistent, brilliant work he'd never bothered to acknowledge or support. Chloe watched his frantic search, her last shred of faith in him crumbling completely. She stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm, no longer willing to pretend his behavior. You knew nothing about her life, Marcus. Nothing. And you stood on a stage and lied about her to everyone. He flinched at her tone, spinning to face her with defensive fury, his composure. I didn't lie. I told the truth of what happened to us. She left me when I had nothing, and now she's benefiting from the life I started building. You're rewriting history to feed your ego, Chloe shot back, her voice sharp with disappointment. You painted yourself a victim tonight, but you never once told anyone you discouraged her from building a career, that you wanted her to stay home and support only your dreams. You made her sound weak and unmotivated and a lie. Their quiet argument ignited in full view of lingering guests, and the last of Marcus's sympathetic audience drifted away, sensing the narrative they'd believed was. As Marcus and Chloe clashed, Lena turned to Evelyn, her tone and resolute. Now is your chance. Everyone's seeing the truth now. Julian just validated every part of your hard work. You can fight straight. Evelyn's chest tightened, every suppressed emotion from the night crashing over her. The shame of the public humiliation, the frustration of being misjudged, the exhaustion of hiding her truth for years. She'd spent half a decade avoiding conflict, choosing healing over confrontation. But Marcus's relentless ego had a choice. She pulled her phone from her clutch, navigating to the encrypted cloud folder she'd preserved for years. Inside were dated business sketches, original proposal outlines, early financial projections. Every piece of proof that the core startup concept Marcus had used to build his empire had been hers first. Drafted long before their divorce, buried and stolen while she'd supported his dreams. The evidence was clean, time-stampable. Evelyn had always kept the files out of quiet self-preservation, never intending to use them, never wanting to reopen old wound, ugly drama. She'd wanted to move forward, not backward. But tonight Marcus had forced her hand. He'd turned her resilience into weakness, her kindness into opportunity for his lies, and destroyed her reputation publicly for no reason other than pride. The room's atmosphere shifted entirely. The crowd no longer watched with judgment or pity. They watched her with curiosity and newfound respect, waiting to see how she would respond to what Marcus had created. Marcus, now fully aware his public victory had collapsed, abandoned his argument with Chloe and locked eyes with Evelyn across the ballroom. His gaze was no longer triumphant. It was panicked, defensive, and dangerously desperate. He could feel the room turning against him, could sense his carefully crafted persona unraveling by the second. And in that moment, Evelyn knew the worst was still ahead. Marcus would not surrender quietly. Cornered and humiliated in front of every peer they shared, he would lash out harder to save his reputation. As she tightened her grip on her phone, staring down at the proof she'd hidden for years, she braced herself for the final, brutalation of the night's war. Panic curdled into raw, unfiltered rage in Marcus's chest as he felt the room slip out of his control. The sympathetic smiles that had buoyed him minutes earlier were gone, replaced by quiet side glances and uncertain murmurs. Julian's public praise of Evelyn's career had cracked his perfect victim narrative wide open, leaving his ego bruised and his reputation teetering. Cornered and desperate to salvage his image, Marcus abandoned all pretense of grace and set out to burn every bridge he could, starting with spreading petty, unsubstantiated rumors to anyone who would listen. He drifted through small alumni clusters, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur, hinting that Evelyn's corporate success was built on shortcuts, that she'd climbed the ranks through office favoritism, that her quiet demeanor masked a bitter, calculating personality who'd abandoned her marriage to chase status. He wove half-truths and outright lies together, trying to counter Julian's credible praise with vague, damaging insinuations. For a fleeting moment, the tactic worked. A handful of old classmates hesitated, unsure of who or what to believe, their newly restored respect for Evelyn wavering once again. Chloe could no longer pretend to overlook his toxicity. She'd spent months admiring his poise and professional discipline, convincing herself his guarded attitude about his ex-wife was just residual heartbreak. But watching him weaponize gossip to destroy a woman's reputation, solely to soothe his own wounded pride, stripped away every illusion she'd held about him. She stepped back, physically distancing herself from his side, her expression cold and resolute. The man she'd agreed to build a future with did not exist. Not in this ballroom, not anymore. While Marcus fought to regain public favor, Lena confronted Evelyn with the frustration she'd held back all night. "You have the proof. You've had it for years," she said, voice tight with exasperation. "You let him lie to everyone. Let him post that video. Let him ruin your name again and again. When are you going to stop protecting him?" Evelyn flinched at her friend's sharp tone, overwhelmed by exhaustion and guilt. She'd avoided fighting back not out of weakness, but out of a desperate desire to leave her painful past buried. She'd wanted closure without conflict, healing without... But Marcus had never given her that option. The pressure of the night crashed over her all at once. The public humiliation, the viral online slander, the crowd's shifting judgment, Lena's disappointment, and the weight of years of unacknowledged sacrifice. For half a decade, she'd hidden her pain, minimized her losses, and prioritized peace over justice. She'd told herself letting go meant refusing to retaliate, that dignity meant rising above. But tonight, that choice had left her isolated, misunderstood, and powerless against a man who refused to stop her. Isolation settled over her like a heavy... Her professional credibility was tangled up in public doubt, her closest friend frustrated with her inaction, and her only witness to the truth, Julian, was a professional colleague, not someone who knew the full ugly story of her marriage. For the first time all night, Evelyn felt alone, trapped between a past she'd tried to escape and a present that was rapidly needing air to clear her mind. She slipped through the side exit of the ballroom and stepped onto the hotel's quiet outdoor terrace. The hum of the party faded behind the closed doors, replaced by the cool Seattle night breeze and the distant crash of waters. She leaned against the metal railing, her hands trembling slightly as she processed everything that had gone wrong. Her attempt to handle the night with grace had backfired. Her restraint had been mistaken for guilt, her patience for cowardice, and her kindness. She pulled out her phone and opened the encrypted folder she'd safeguarded years. Time-stamped from long before their divorce, the files were irrefutable proof of her original business blueprint, the exact framework Marcus had stolen, refined, and turned into his million company. She'd kept the evidence not to destroy him, but to herself. A quiet insurance policy for a day she'd hoped come. She'd always believed exposing him would drag her back into the trauma she'd worked so hard to overcome, that revenge would poison her peace. But staring at the screen now, Evelyn realized peace was no longer an option. Marcus had crossed every line. He'd humiliated her publicly, lied about her character to their entire alumni network, viralized his false narrative online, and sabotaged her reputation for no reason other than jealousy. If she continued to stay silent, his lies would become permanent truth in the eyes of everyone they knew. She would forever be the selfish ex-wife who abandoned a good man, while he remained the sympathetic. In the quiet darkness of the terrace, Evelyn made her final, irreversible decision. She was no longer running from her past, no longer prioritizing mercy over truth. She would no longer let Marcus's ego define her story. She closed the folder with steady hands, her fear replaced by unshakable resolve. She would return to that ballroom, face the crowd, and lay out the full ball. Back inside, Marcus was convinced and control. His rumors had sown enough doubt to muddy the narrative, and he believed Evelyn continued to hide, too passive and afraid to fight back. He preened for the crowd, accepting parted compliments, already planning one final public gesture to cement his victory for the night. He approached the MC, voice loud and confident, requesting one final, impromptu microphone spot to deliver a closing reunion. Unaware that Evelyn's quiet era of restraint was over, Marcus prepared the final blow. What he intended to be his victory speech would instead become the stage's total downfall. Because when Evelyn stepped back into that ballroom, she was no longer the woman he'd bullied, underestimated, and erased. She was ready to finish the war he'd started once and for all. The ballroom fell dead quiet the second Marcus's fingers wrapped around the microphone. The soft music cut out. Every scattered conversation died mid-breath, and hundreds of alumni eyes locked onto him, waiting for his closing speech. He stood tall on the small stage, adjusting the mic with practiced confidence, still convinced he could salvage his crumbling reputation with one final, polished performance. The crowd's earlier doubt lingered in the air, but Marcus thrived on last-minute comebacks, and he intended to paint himself as the gracious, forgiving victim one last time. Evelyn stepped back through the terrace doors moments later. Her entire demeanor shifted. The shaky hesitation, the careful restraint, the quiet willingness to let lies slide. All of it was gone. She walked slowly through the crowd, head high, her steps steady and unrushed, every inch of her body language signaling she was no longer here to observe, no longer here to endure. Lena watched her approach, relief flashing across her face, recognizing instantly that her best friend was finally ready to defend herself. Marcus began his speech, his voice warm and measured, designed to pull the room back to his side. "Tonight's been a night of reflection," he started, sweeping his gaze across the crowd. 15 years brings a lot of growth, a lot of change, and a lot of perspective on the people we once loved. I've spent years building a life I'm proud of, turning late nights and uncertainty into stability and success. I've always believed you leave the past where it belongs, with gratitude, no bitterness. He paused, letting the gentle tone settle before sliding in his final subtle strike. I hope Evelyn can one day find that same peace. I hope she can acknowledge the foundation we built together, the groundwork that allowed her to grow into the role she has now. Not everyone gets to walk away from a marriage and still thrive. I consider myself fortunate to have moved forward, and I wish her nothing but the best. The passive-aggressive dig landed perfectly for anyone still clinging to his earlier narrative. A few guests nodded sympathetically, buying his fake humility entirely. Chloe, standing off to the side, closed her eyes briefly, exhausted by his endless manipulation. She knew exactly what he was doing, burying his cruelty under kindness, framing Evelyn's hard-won success as a handout from their failed marriage, and securing his place as the better, more evolved person in front of everyone. Before Marcus could step away from the microphone, Evelyn spoke. Her voice was clear, calm, and unshakable, cutting through the room's quiet like a clean blade. "That's a beautiful story, Marcus. It's just not the one." Every head in the room snapped toward her. The sympathetic murmurs died instantly, replaced by sharp electric silence. Marcus froze mid-smile, his confident facade cracking the second she challenged him. She walked forward until she stood level with the stage, no longer hidden in the crowd, no longer shrinking from judgment. "For 15 years, you've told everyone we know that I left you because I was lazy, because I hated the hustle, because I refused to build a life," she said, her tone steady but "You've spent our entire post-marriage life painting me as the quitter and yourself as the self-mo. Tonight, you've lied to this room, you've lied online, and you've rewritten our history to feed." Marcus's jaw tightened. "This isn't lace." "It is exactly lace." Evelyn cut him off, no longer allowing him to interrupt or control. "You chose this stage. You chose to broadcast your version of our marriage to hundreds of people. You chose to humiliate me publicly for no reason. So now everyone here gets to—" She lifted her phone, holding it up so those closest to the stage could see the screen. "The startup made you wealthy? The business that turned you into the successful entrepreneur everyone admires? The original proposal, the full operational framework, the client outreach strategy, and the core business model were mine. I drafted it 2 years before our divorce. I stayed up countless nights refining it, while you focused on networking and social climbing. I handed it to you because I believed in us. I believed we'd build it together." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Murmurs exploded across the ballroom, alumni leaning forward in shock, eyes wide with belief. Evelyn continued, her voice roaring. "You took my work, rebranded it under your name, pitched it to investors behind my back, and waited until the business gained traction to divorce. You left me with nothing. No credit, no compensation, no recognition. You erased my contribution entirely, and spent years telling everyone I abandoned your dream. I didn't abandon you, Marcus. You stole my future and then lied to cover it up. She lowered her phone, her gaze locking firmly on his now pale, terrified face. My career today isn't built on your foundation. It's built on the years I spent rebuilding after you took everything I created. I didn't get lucky. I didn't take shortcuts. I worked for every promotion, every milestone, every win. All while you profited off my stolen ID. Grateful. Marcus's composed completely. Red-faced and furious, he gripped the microphone tighter, his offensively. That's slander. You're bitter because you couldn't keep up. This is ridiculous, fabricated drama, is it? Julian Hale stepped forward then, moving calmly to stand beside Evelyn, his presence unarguable. I've seen the stamped documents, Marcus. Dated 2 years before your company's founding. The structural matches to Evelyn's original framework are undeniable. Her work is on record, long before your first investor. The final thread of Marcus's reputation snapped. The crowd turned on him instantly, every sympathetic glance vanishing, every prior judgment toward Evelyn melted understanding. All the pieces clicked for the alumni, the unnecessary cruelty, the desperate need to win, the obsessive her success. It had never been about her quitting. It had always been about his guilt, his fear of being exposed, and his need to bury his theft beneath a false narrative of victimhood. Chloe walked forward slowly, her expression cold and final. She met Marcus's panicked eyes, her voice quiet but unmistakable, one nearby to hear. I can't do this anymore. I fell for a man who pretended to be honorable. You're just someone who steals credit and bullies people to... We're done. She turned and walked away without another word, leaving him frozen on stage, alone. Marcus stood there, center stage in a silent ballroom, every eye in the room judging him. The charm, the confidence, the perfect self-made image, all to dust in an instant. He had no rebuttal, no defense, no way to spin the truth he'd spent years hiding. The crowd he'd spent the entire night trying to win over him exactly as he was. Insecure, dishonest, cruel. Evelyn scanned the room, finally free of the weight for over a decade. She was not bitter, not triumphant in a cruel, just relieved. The lies were out. The truth was public. Her reputation was restored. She turned away from the stage, from Marcus's humiliated stare, and walked at her side. The night that was supposed to be Marcus's greatest victory, his permanent downfall. The quiet, overlooked ex-wife he'd set out to humiliate had reclaimed her truth, her dignity, and her identity. As she stepped out of the ballroom into the cool Seattle night air, Evelyn knew the old chapter of her life was fully closed. No more hiding, no more silence, no more letting someone else write her story. For the first time in 15 years, she was completely free.